Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Been a while, I know. Very, very busy this end with one thing or another. Now, before we go on, I am going to have to put content warnings up on the beginning of this video. We are going to be discussing Nabokov's Lolita, and that means also discussing its subject matter, its nature, its import. This is a book about child abuse. It is a book about the psychology of abusers. And in that regard, this is likely to get rather triggering, especially for those who have direct experience of this matter. I have indirect experience of this matter as a carer. I have cared for people and supported people who have been abused, and in one or two instances, I have even worked with people who are themselves abusers in some way, shape, or form. So I do have some degree of insight into this matter. I'm also studying a psychology degree at the moment. In the interests of going into therapy, and abuse is going to be a big part of that. Now, the reason I'm talking about Nabokov's Lolita is because it was going around the internet again. It actually had a resurgence in internet circles, largely because of an old interview that our very good friend, Miss Joanne Rowling, gave many, many years ago. Give her credit. This was a long time ago. And this is not going to be about bashing Joanne, for the simple reason she's doing a good job of that all herself at the moment. She is going down the route of becoming this age's Orson Scott Card very, very quickly. But in an interview from, I think it was about 10 or 20 years ago, Joanne made the really rather bizarre statement that he described Nabokov's Lolita as a tragic love story. And that just baffled me. I don't understand, having read the book. I read it at university. It was on a recommended reading list. I don't understand how anyone can come away with it with that interpretation. I have no idea. I literally have no idea how anyone can come away from it with that interpretation. Having read, if you read wider, if you read Nabokov's own statements about his work, that is absolutely not the case. It is absolutely not either intended nor written, nor does it function as a love story in any way, shape, or form. And it's really interesting that a lot of the sort of moral criticism of Nabokov's Lolita seems to derive from this very interpretation, that somehow it is conducive or somehow apologetic of abuse or sensationalizing of it, and that is simply not true. It is an absolute misreading of the text. Nabokov himself has been absolutely clear about this, and also it is implicit within the text. The problem I think people have is that this is not a text that operates in literal terms. You cannot appreciate the nature of the text, the import of the text, if you read it in a literal fashion. What you're presented with in Lolita is an account of a life of abuse from the perspective of the abuser. What Nabokov is trying to do is force the reader to read between the lines, to read beneath the words. The prose itself that Nabokov utilizes, which is filtered through the words and language of Humbert Humbert, who is the narrator and who is also the abuser, um, is designed to flummox you. It's designed to be flowery and overly romantic and overly poetic, while simultaneously describing some of the most awful things you can possibly put to paper. What Humbert Humbert does is he is giving an account that is designed to be apologetic, overly romantic, that is designed to justify himself. He is a narcissist. He is a 100% narcissist, if not psychopath. Certainly, he is a classic abuser. This is the other thing with this text. In order to get the most out of it, you need to really understand how these psychologies work. You need to understand the mindset of an abuser, of a narcissist. You also need to have some grounding not necessarily in psychology, but you need to understand something about the psychological vogue that were around during the period of the book's writing and initial publication. Because one of the things Nabokov does with the book is he casts enormous shade on popular psychological theory and understanding of the time. At the time, Freud and Jung's work, psychoanalysis, really was in the ascendancy, it was in the vogue, and Nabokov has no truck with it. Nabokov has a real problem with therapy, with psychoanalysis, with the theory of psychoanalysis, which he brings to bear in this book. Humbert Humbert is a narcissist, but he is an educated man. He understands what is vogue at the time. He certainly understands how counselors and therapists work. So during the brief periods when he is obliged to go and see a psychiatrist or a counselor, he plays games with them. He gives them the answers that they want to hear with regards to the theories they subscribe to. And in that, he either charms them or he throws them off the scent. He makes them believe that he is somehow cured or that he is on the path to recovery, that he is a better man, when he's not. He's just fucking about with them. Because again, he has the psychology of an abuser, of a narcissist. And narcissists love this. They love to play games, they love to demonstrate their apparent superiority over people. Particularly those who are supposed to be in a position of authority themselves. They cannot stand that. They cannot stand that. Insofar as they are concerned, the world is their playground and it bends to them. It is designed and exists to feed their ego and their narcissism, to give them supply. That's why it exists. And anything that doesn't do that is de facto evil. It is unfair, it is an irritant, it is a pollutant, and it is to be gotten rid of. And once again, having that understanding and reading Humbert's account, it's easy to see that. That's exactly how he perceives anything that presents a barrier to his base desires. And this man is not just an abuser, he is, by very definition, a pedophile. He is attracted exclusively to young girls, primarily those between the ages of 9 and 14. That's the very narrow barrier that he subscribes to. That's the very narrow parameters that he's attracted to. And anything that stands in the way of that, whether it's society, whether it's individuals, whether it's parents or guardians or whatever, he simply regards them as irritants and as obstacles and as nothing else. They are things to be gotten over, to be taken advantage of, or to be eradicated. Nor does he ascribe humanity to his victims. That's the other thing. One of the most complex things about this book is that you really need to understand who his victims are. And that's very difficult because he does his very best to diminish and destroy their humanity and their individuality, any agency they have outside of his fantasies. The very title of the book, Lolita, that is what he calls the object of his obsessions, a young girl called Dolores. By the way, the name Dolores is brilliant because it tells you everything about this girl. It tells you some fundamental truth about her outside of the pantomimic, cartoon-like fantasist doll that Humbert Humbert constructs. Dolores, a name which means lachrymose, which means sad, which means empty, that's this girl. Certainly after he's done with her, but actually before that too. She is, in many respects, I mean, this demonstrates Nabokov's incredible intelligence and understanding of this subject matter. He understands not only abusers but victims. He understands the kinds of children that abusers like Humbert Humbert would necessarily go for. A child of a broken family, of a mother who is dependent, codependent, who requires some support in her life, who herself has a yearning for a kind of romantic life, for some sort of grand love affair in the styles of romantic fiction. Humbert comes into their life understanding that, and he takes full advantage of it. Full advantage. He ends up actually marrying her mother at one point. And it's fascinating how he talks about the adult women in this book, because adult women almost don't exist for him. They are irritating. They are almost animalistic. They're almost like environmental phenomena that get on his nerves. He can't stand them. He can't stand them in terms of the way they operate, their psychology, their mannerisms, their physical reality. He's actively disgusted by Dolores's mother, and he mocked her constantly in his writing, in his journals. He talks about her as flabby and strangely shaped, and because she is a woman, because she is a grown woman, and he is not attracted to that. It's very disturbing, but it's a very accurate portrayal of how people of Humbert's peculiar psychology operate. It's very, very dark, very unpleasant, but well worth your time, because especially if you do have an interest in these aberrant forms of psychology, as I do, largely as a result of my work. I work in social care and support, and I'm looking to transition into therapy at some point, hence what I'm doing at the moment. This book is fantastic. It's fantastic for understanding abusers and how they operate, the dynamics of victims, but also the psychology of victims, despite this being an account from Humbert himself, and despite it being overly romanticized, almost cartoonish at times, in its absurd romanticism, you do get this sort of bleed through of the reality of Dolores. You see Dolores beneath the veneer of Lolita come through occasionally. And it's whenever she displays a reality that Humbert can't cope with. Because, of course, in his purview, she's not real. She's not a human being. She is a vessel or a sort of mannequin, a doll upon which he projects this fantasy. He does everything that an abuser does as well, by the way. He accuses her of somehow wanting what he does, of being complicit in what he does. Again, this is really common amongst abusers of children. It's common amongst rapists and abusers, full stop, but it's very common amongst abusers of children. They will blame the child. They will sexualize the child and say that they were somehow seduced, or they couldn't help it, or that whatever, that. And they will also, there is almost like a religious or superstitious element to them. They will talk about and what they're talking about actually is opportunism. And Humbert certainly believes this, that there is some sort of like metaphysics that's driving them together, some conspiracy of fate that's driving them together, because this is destined to happen. And of course, this is all overly flowery and romantic and tragic and metaphysical, but it's bullshit. It is absolute bullshit. And Nabokov is aware of that fact. He is doing this to demonstrate the dichotomy that exists between the prose, the account that Humbert is giving, and the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is he is a grubby, abusive narcissist. That is who is only whose desires are entirely base, and he is obsessed with dominion of young girls. He can't even cope with adult women. That is very clear, even though he talks about his superiority over them constantly. He belittles women constantly, adult women, but heaps praise upon and exaggerates the apparent intelligence and sexual cunning of his little Lolitas, of his victims, makes them complicit. He makes them complicit in his own mind, and certainly in his account, as a means of justifying himself. It's an amazingly adroit and apt and accurate portrayal of how abusers work, especially when they're forced to give accounts of themselves, as Humbert is here. I mean, this is effectively a testimony to a court, to a jury. That's what he's giving here. And it's amazing. It is an absolutely amazing text. It's one that often flies in the face of the brute literalism with which we, in the present age, I suppose you could call it in the digital or the internet age, approach fiction and media. There is this terrible disease in exegesis, in interpretation and criticism, particularly here on the internet, where everything is taken literally. Every account, every word is taken literally. And Nabokov's fiction, actually, across the board, if you do that, then you will hate it. You will hate it because, for example, if you read Lolita, it may very well look like an almost pornographic almost pornographic account of abuse. It may look like a romanticization of abuse, and it may come across as morally reprehensible in that regard. And a lot of people have taken it that way. There are a lot of people who have taken it that way. And don't get me wrong, I can see how, even understanding what Nabokov was trying to do, you can interpret this text that way. It is a case of horses for courses. You are going to have to dive in and see for yourself. This is not a text everyone can read. This is not a text everyone will be comfortable with. This is not a text everyone should read because it is horrible. It is a repulsive, disturbing, truly outrageous piece of work. For my money, for me, for what I seek from fiction, I think it is genius. I think it is absolutely beautiful, and I think it's doing what fiction should be doing at its most ideal, in the sense that it is exposing people to these phenomena. Another thing that Nabokov is doing. He was of a very moral character by all accounts, and he loathed abuse. He loathed one of the reasons he hated Freud was because of the abuse that Freud had committed during his psychological studies of young people, of children, and the tacit apologies that his theories provided for abusers of children. He hated it so, so much. One of the reasons he makes Humbert Humbert the way he is, why he gives him this stupid name, Humbert Humbert, is to belittle him. One of the things Humbert does throughout the text is you can see his narcissism shining through. He describes himself in glowing terms. He is always the most intelligent man in the room. He's always the most educated man in the room. He's the most capable man in the room. He also describes himself as handsome and as attractive and able to take advantage of women. All of it bullshit. And if you look at the text with a critical eye, if you look between the lines and look at what he's trying to mask rather than what he's trying to express, then you get the gist of it. Then you start to see the the seething anger in this text. I mean, this is an angry text. This is so profoundly furious. It's pointing a finger at so much. There is an incredible moralism to this text, which is ironic when you look at the criticism which is condemning it for its apparent amorality. There is a furious, almost puritanical fervor and fury and condemnation in this text. It's a very rare piece of work, which is from the perspective of a character who is entirely loathsome, and which the text itself actively loathes. Nabokov made no bones about this. If you do the wider reading, once again, he made no bones about it. He described Humbert as a wastrel, as a scoundrel, as a monster, as the worst creature under the sun. And yet, part of the exercise is that he wrote this long form novel from the perspective and centering around the entirely execrable exploits of this piece of shit human being, but which holds your attention, which is it can be repulsive, it can be alienating, but which is so brilliantly written, so beautifully written, in fact, that it holds your attention. It doesn't sort of turn you away. It's a stunning experiment. It is a stunning piece of work. A lot of people would say that child abuse is something that shouldn't be explored in fiction or art in general, and I couldn't disagree more. I could not disagree more. And there is no subject that is taboo insofar as I'm concerned. And in fact, I would argue that part of the point of fiction and art in general is to approach taboos and to hold them up to society, to show society the things that it would rather not look at or acknowledge. And at the time of Nabokov's writing, child abuse would have been endemic throughout Europe, throughout the UK, throughout America, throughout our cultures. It would have been absolutely endemic, and abusive women, in fact. Patriarchal, basically objectification of women, of children, of any demographic that it didn't consider to be particularly useful to itself. And that's what he was really exploring. It's quite brilliant, I've got to say. And into that, he draws in all of these other criticisms. He approaches things like psychoanalysis, like therapy, which he absolutely loathed, by the way. He loathed. And also, I mean, it's ironic because he proved rather prescient in that regard. As our good friend of this channel, Hannibal Lecter, says, psychoanalysis is indeed a dead religion. Although Freud's work is regarded as an artifact of psychology, it is most certainly not revered anymore. There is largely no such thing as a Freudian therapist anymore, or a Freudian psychologist. It just doesn't work that way anymore. He proved rather prescient in that regard. I mean, it's the matter for another video, but Nabokov himself was very well educated in the experiments that Freud committed and the theorems he derived from as a result. But he's also very aware of the incredible flaws and innately abusive nature of those experiments. And he had an especial loathing for them. And that's part of the key of this book. It's part of the key of this book. He loathes anything that provides apology for abusers and which belittles the victims. Dolores is one of the most amazing characters because you are presented with, as all the characters are, you are presented with this either exaggeration or distortion of them. You are presented with a pantomime of who they are based on what Humbert requires them to be within the purview of his fantasies, within this distorted realm through which he operates, that he weaves about himself. He lives in a world of delusions and of lies to the point whereby there are certain key moments in the text that you have to really scratch your chin at. Like, for example, there's a point, massive spoilers, by the way. There is a point where Dolores's mother dies. In Humbert's account, what happens is she finds his journal in which he describes some of the awful things that he would like to do to Dolores. And she runs out of the house and ends up getting run over by a car. It's really strange. There is something about that moment which seems, in the way that Humbert describes it, too coincidental, too convenient. It feels like he's trying to mask over something that he did. Maybe he threw her into the street, maybe he pushed her in front of the car to stop her reporting his abuse of her daughter. Whatever the case, it requires you, as the reader, to engage with Humbert's account with a degree of in, sincere criticism and understanding of who and what this man is, and the fact that he is lying to you. He is constantly lying to you. He is distorting the truth and even just entirely abandoning it on multiple occasions as a means of diminishing his own monstrosity and of justifying himself, but also reinforcing this romantic web of lies in which he lives. This man is a deluded monster. It's hard to say to what degree he believes in the delusions and to what degree they are just conscious. You know, he is a conscious liar, like most narcissists are. It's very hard to say. You have to sort of infer that for yourself. But that's what makes the text so brilliant, insofar as I'm concerned. That's what makes the text so utterly compelling and brilliant. He Nabokov invites you to engage with the text in the manner of a puzzle. You have to read it in a manner that sees past the language and sees past the claims of the writing, and that is so absurdly brilliant. It's so absurdly brilliant. Very unusual, especially in this day and age where everything is down the line bloody literal. And it's so brilliantly done here. It's so brilliantly done. If you do that, you start to see Dolores for who she is, which is this broken, already traumatized. By the time Humbert comes into her life, she's a troubled young girl. She is a troubled girl who has problems with her mother, issues with her lack of father, her parentage, her family dynamic. And he comes into her life as initially as a stabilizing influence, as something she can rely upon other than her mother, confide in. But of course, that's all a manipulation. That's all utter bullshit that he's using to get close to her, to become more intimate with her. And later on, she becomes this resourceful young woman who manages to get away from this piece of shit that has destroyed her life. She becomes much stronger. She becomes stronger than him. That's for damn sure. She becomes stronger than Humbert, even though he manipulates things so that he is able to abuse her for quite a long time. And she manages to get away from him. She manages ultimately to get away from him and leave him pretty desolate without anything, you know? It's a harrowing, dark, and very, very, very difficult text, but it is utterly brilliant. It is utterly brilliant. And I would say if you are interested in the dynamics of abuse and abusers and how they operate, you've got to read it. You've got to read it because it nails it. Nabokov nails it. He understands these creatures, he understands these human beings in a way that is really hard to credit. It is hard to credit. It's so cute and so prescient and so particular. It's brilliant. I mean, it is without doubt one of the most brilliant texts I've ever read. It is up there, and also one of the most harrowing, one of the most difficult, and one I cannot wholeheartedly recommend. I mean, as I said at the top, if you feel that this might be too much for you, or if you have first-hand experience of what it's describing, it might be too much. It might because it's very true. It's very true in the way it describes both abusers and their victims and the dynamics in which they operate. And that, yeah, it's emotive. Let's put it that way. It's emotive, it's evocative, and it is highly, highly brilliant. Not, Joanne, a love story.